Okay, so now we are live?
Yep.
Okay, so again, condensed version. Looking at our agenda, item 1 was to look at where we stand on our 2021 budget and where we are through March. Again, no surprises. We are just where we thought we would be. Looking forward into 2021, we don't see any reason why we won't be able to make the budget in 2021. Recall that when we passed the budget, we had a deficit of about $37,000. Part of that deficit was a 25 or so thousand contingency. And so we don't see where we would exceed that. We might do better than the deficit number. So that looks good going forward. One other thing that I mentioned is we typically look at some spreadsheets for budgets looking out forward. That is going to change from this point. We're going to start using accounting software provided by the state of Ohio. And it's a software that it's not going to cost us anything much to change to it. And the upgrades will be done on a periodic basis. And David will be able to incorporate that and use that to develop projections. And projections coming out of the village office, I think, is a much better idea than being generated through council. So that's how we'll move. That's how we'll proceed going forward. We do have some numbers we can talk about to start to project where we think we will be in 2022 based on some changes that we will see this year. And we're going to kind of just set this against the 2021 budget. So again, we had projected a $37,000 deficit. If we do not use any contingency, the deficit will drop into the neighborhood of about $12,000, which is less than 0.5% of a $2.5 million budget. So it's not earth-shattering. Through some staff changes that have occurred both at the administrative level and with our police chief retiring, and we're going to have to get we have an interim chief who will either step up to that position or a new chief. But through those changes, through the year 2022, we're estimating there could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 or possibly $35,000 less expenditures for personnel. And part of that depends on whether or not one of David's new hires would take healthcare. It's a younger individual. He may not want it or need it. Part of that also depends on what we will see as potential increases for next year for personnel. On the revenue side, and there are other very minor changes that could occur, but nothing significant enough to work into planning at this moment. On the revenue side, the UDF building is built, but we have yet to see any revenue from that from a tax standpoint. Taxes are paid in arrears. There's a chance we might get half of a year in December. That was not budgeted, though. It was not in our budget figures. Right now, from what we can see on the auditor's site, it looks like the UDF revenue in 2022 would be about $7,000. So given the changes in personnel, compensation, and the new revenue for the UDF building, that would be $37,000 to $42,000 difference to the good. So in that way, saying it another way, if we had those changes all through this year, which we did not, we had a part of the year where we had our police chief, part of the year we had our previous administrator, part of the year we had our previous bookkeeper. But if we had those changes in this year, we would have basically a balanced budget, maybe a slight surplus. So going into 2022, if these adjustments hold, and we think they will, we would go into that year with basically a net zero or a balanced budget. What we would have to factor in then is what type of increases would occur. On a very rough level, we have a budget of about $2.5 million. Normal rate of inflation is about 2%. So that's 50,000. So just looking at first blush, you would say then that your deficit could be as high as about $50,000. Now, bear in mind, our budgets have a contingency number in them of 25,000 that may or may not be used. It's just a kind of a safety placeholder. So if that wasn't used, your deficit would end up being $25,000. So just to give some reference, in the past, this council, or Glendale's council, has passed budgets and opted to use reserves for deficits as high as $50,000. I think in one case it was even $60,000 when we were in the middle of the last recession. I prefer a balanced budget myself. I prefer a small surplus myself. I think that having any type of deficit just erodes your resources that the village has. And so that's what I prefer. But my purpose today, and I think council's purpose today, is to look at and evaluate that position that we will be in, roughly with that contingency. Again, it would be a $50,000 negative. Now, moving on, if there are no major changes to anything, it's easy to calculate that you would see in the following year probably a roughly $50,000 increase in expense.
Mike.
But bear with me, let me finish this and then I'll be done. So
All
2023 could then be somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 loss. And at a $100,000 loss, I just don't think the village can stand that. So that's the breaking point, definitely, where more revenue or some reduction in expenses is mandatory. So now I'm done. Marilyn, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, I had a question a while ago. Of course, you've mentioned so many other things.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm going to take you back to the UDF.
Yes.
Possibly $7,000
Yes.
revenue, whereas the village has not received any thus far since the building was completed.
Correct.
What is the basis of that revenue? Is it the real property tax?
Yes, they pay, that would be what we have calculated as the Glendale portion of their tax. Of course, there's a much higher number that goes to the school district and then some other things.
Okay.
That would be Glendale's part.
All right. Now, if you could just slow down a bit more, because we do not have the numbers before us. And I'm trying to follow your projection of a 30 to 50,000 possible deficit in 2022.
Well,
Did I hear you say?
Mm-hmm. So in 2022, well, given the changes that we anticipate in personnel compensation and in revenue from mainly UDF, we could anticipate roughly $37,000 to $42,000 improvement to the budget. So improvement to what we're looking at this year as a $37,000 deficit. So that's where I say in 2022, if we do nothing if we make no increases in expenses, 2022 would be a balanced budget if we would not increase expenses at all, given the changes that will occur in that year. Those changes are to the administrative staff, the police personnel budget, and a revenue increase from UDF.
And the fire department.
I'm not aware of any changes for the fire department currently.
But when you were rolling up, you were saying that presumed no changes.
No
in that
changes for, yeah, no changes for
Okay.
anything.
I just wanted to make sure that was a part of it. Okay.
Mike, when you say no changes, do you mean not even the normal 2% increase
That's,
we expect
yes.
for inflation?
Right, that's what I'm saying. And so if there was a normal 2% increase to a $2.5 million budget, that's where you would say then that the deficit then projected for 2022, not this year, but the coming year, would be $50,000 if you had the 2% increase on a 2.5 million budget.
Could I ask a question, or I'm not sure Marilyn is finished yet?
Go ahead. Thank you.
It's an easy one. Remind me, please, Mike,
Mhm.
the last time we had a significant increase in revenue, I'm thinking levy. When was the last time we had it?
The last levy that we had
Yeah.
was, I think, 9 years ago, David.
Okay, that's what okay. Thank
Was it
you.
2012?
2012, I remember it well.
1.5 mils,
Correct.
So we're into a decade without an increase.
pretty much.
It's insane.
Correct.
Isn't it
Okay.
amazing?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. A little bit of luck and
Thank you.
some very tight belts.
Thank you.
Mhm. It's a good point. So I have down towards the end of the agenda, discussion about revenue increases and possible expense reductions in order to balance the budget. We already beat the budget to death last year. There are no expense reductions. I wonder if it would be good to get through the rest of the agenda and then leave our discussion for how we are going to increase revenue for the end. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Because I think
Sure.
that'll be a more lengthy part of discussion. The rest of this is just fact. Okay. So moving on through the agenda, we have the major capital expenditures for this year. And one of those is to repave Sharon Road, which we have been planning on for a long time. The other one is the stormwater system up near Bethany School. And Bethany School is doing the work to control their stormwater, and we are going to also do some work with our stormwater and try to control that better. That involves the sewer system plus repaving after that work is finished. David put together for the Streets Committee his plan for timing and funding. So David, do you have that? And do you want to go through that for this?
I
Okay.
do, and with pleasure. Let me pull it up here. Once it lets me. 1 second.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay.
Did you get it?
Well, I don't know if it thinks I'm connected to another monitor or what, but I can pull it up here if you give me 1 second to find it in a different spot.
Okay.
All right. So I have to go through it this way, but that's no problem. So to those on the Streets Committee, this will be a repeat of that presentation. But the first is the Sharon Avenue repave. In discussions with our engineer, the total estimated project cost, including a 20% contingency on construction, which would be built in on the engineering estimate side, not on the bidding side. So any contractor bidding this job would not be aware that we have a 20% contingency budgeted or set aside, would be 1.25 million. So 1 million for the project and then 250,000 set aside as a contingency, more or less. Then a minimal engineering is estimated to be required. Bid preparation, specifications, minimal construction observation. Luckily, Tom here in the village office is very well equipped to oversee this. So we'll be taking advantage of his knowledge. Goal is to have it ready to bid or advertised in April or May, more than likely starting bidding advertisements before the end of April, running it for the required minimum of 2 weeks, maybe an additional week, opening bids in May, following engineer guidance and recommendation, have something for council approval at the June 7 meeting. So based on that information and then that total estimated cost, present here 4 possible sources for funding to put together that $1.25 million project cost. The first is municipal road funding from the county. This is grant funding that the village has applied for other projects many years ago. And the Sharon Road Bridge was actually that project that was back in, I believe it was in 2012, 2013, before we finally were able to execute that funding recently to get that project completed. But we have reapplied and we are above the cutoff line for the recommendation for funding approval. So feel very, very confident that we'll be receiving that funding. The second is the street construction fund. Council will know this better as our annual street program. We spend approximately $150,000 out of that fund. That's collected from gas tax, motor vehicle registration. So a total of $150,000. Conversations with Tom, he feels confident that we can put off any kind of interior street replacement or resurfacing, SAMI sealing for this year to work on Sharon. Excuse my dog in the background there. The other 2 lines, the general fund cash balance. So this is the increase in the reserves of the general fund. At the end of 2020, we realized approximately $350,000 increase in the general fund cash balance. And then that leaves us with a balance of about $625,000 in VPGI to bring us to that total cost of $1.25 million, which includes a 20% contingency. Second project, unless are there questions about Sharon or?
Yes, David, can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I did not hear what you were saying.
Yeah, I apologize. My dog, I think the mail's here.
The general fund
Yeah.
cash balance, you were speaking of the reserve or a balance, a cash on hand in the general fund at the end of 2020?
Yes.
Okay, how much was that?
So at the end of excuse me, I'm sorry. At the end of 2020, the village realized a gain in our general fund to the good of about $350,000. Give me a second here. I'm gonna put some headphones in that'll cut out the barking, hopefully. One second, everyone. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So that 350,000 left over from the year 2020 is still in the general fund, and it's
Correct.
targeted, earmarked for the Sharon Avenue repaving.
Right now, it is, yes, it is sitting in the general fund. Following council appropriation, it would be pulled from the general fund for Sharon Avenue repaving.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the VPGI, 625,000.
Yes.
Did you comment on where that cash is or where that money would be coming from? in particular?
Sure, that funding is sitting in the Village Plan General Improvement Fund, the VPGI fund. Previous projections for this project out of VPGI had the balance at about $1 million. So this is a sizable reduction in the ultimate cost towards the VPGI to complete the Sharon Avenue repaving.
Thank you.
Just to remind everyone, the 625,000 out of the VPGI fund is the source from which any spending of the contingency fund would be drawn. So if the contingency fund is not fully drawn, the amount contributed by the VPGI fund would be reduced.
Correct. So to go off of that, the funds here, the funding sources are listed in a sort of a rough availability or preference, I would say, towards spending. So we would start with the 150 from the Municipal Road Fund, 150 from street construction, 325 from general fund, and then any balance out of VPGI.
Let me ask a follow-up question.
Certainly.
The total cost of 1.2 million,
Mhm.
is that's not, of course, paid all at once up front. So how long, months or whatever, is it anticipated this repaving would require, and over what period of time would revenue need to come in order to meet these expenses?
So we have revenue on hand for the expenses listed here, or cash flow rather, on hand to meet these expenses now. I can't speak to the exact timeline for the project yet. That's something our engineer is working on, although projects like this would be spread out over several months and several pay applications.
Mhm.
So the need for us to cut a $1.25 million check would not be the case. We would pay in several smaller portions and then draw down on these 4 balances as those bills come in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, David, maybe next slide.
All righty. So we'll move on to Hedgerow. The Hedgerow Avenue, this includes Albion, Alt Lane. Everyone's very familiar with this project and what it hopes to alleviate. Based on our application for SCIP funding, so that's street construction improvement funding, the total estimated project cost, and this includes repaving of the project areas disturbed by the underground stormwater work, would be about $650,000. This would include routing stormwater underground to reduce surface ponding during heavy rain events. So it would help to redirect stormwater to an underground system, redirect stormwater from Bethany, and put that into an underground system that would get it off of the roadways, curbing to direct stormwater that is on the roadways into the system, as well as complete a stormwater study to measure the flow of stormwater from public and private property. There are 2 main portions of this. The first would be indicating the stormwater amounts coming from the Oak Avenue Greenbelt, and properties within Woodlawn, and then would also measure the impact on the Warwick Place subdivision. As everyone is aware, all of that stormwater comes moving down Albion Avenue towards that creek that runs behind Warwick Place. And of course, when we talk about routing stormwater to one location and one piping system underground, there are concerns about what's going to happen when it sees daylight. And so a stormwater study would be included in this project to mitigate the effects on the Warwick Place subdivision. There are a lot of options, from baffles to certain types of valves that can help slow the flow of the stormwater so that it does not create any kind of a washout situation or flooding situations downstream. And like I mentioned, the other part of this would be information for private property owners in that area. The engineer and I were speaking about potentially offering suggestions or guidance, even assistance from the contractor on a private, separate basis for those property owners to mitigate stormwater issues on their own properties. But the village is hopeful that by mitigating stormwater on our public right-of-ways, that would hopefully be a minimal part of this overall project. So moving on to funding options for this. As everyone's aware, earlier this year, the American Rescue Plan Act was passed. That included several $1 billion in local funding for projects, for infrastructure projects. One such qualifying expense, according to the U.S. Treasury, are water and sewer infrastructure projects. Based on early estimations, the village is anticipating about $430,000 in this funding. And based on that Treasury guidance, a stormwater management project like this would be a perfect fit to utilize that $430,000 in funding. So as you can see here, I have a rough yearly breakdown for the work that would need to be completed. Now, this is simply for reference. It also points out that these rescue plan funds are coming in two chunks, one chunk in 2021, another chunk in 2022. Now, this is based on that preliminary estimate. So as more information becomes available, certainly pass that along. But based on that estimate and this timeline, it looks like we could anticipate doing the underground work, or a lion's share, or even completing the underground work using $215,000 from the rescue plan funding, supplementing that with $220 from VPGI for a total of $235,000 in 2021, and then following up in 2022 with $215,000 to complete any remaining work, as well as perform repaving on the areas disturbed by the underground portion of this project, which would bring us to the total estimated engineer project cost of about $650,000. So are there any questions on this project?
Yes, there is. Once again, it's Marilyn. You mentioned a stormwater study at the outset of this project, but I don't see that as part of it, or where the money is, or what cost, or the time frame for it. And it seems that study is very critical, especially when you're talking about impacting private property on at least 4 or 5 streets and more, because the creek you're speaking of flows into over past Little Creek, under Sharon Road Avenue, under Sharon Road, and on into the Mill Creek. So we're talking about an influential flow of water here, and the study is needed at the outset for the impact analysis. Where is the study how is that study being funded? When will it occur in the context of this stormwater project before the underground work is commenced?
That's a very good question, and I completely agree with you. This study would be of the utmost importance to make sure that any underground work is focused on solving the current problem as well as preventing any future problems. So this study would occur near the beginning, or at the beginning of this work. It would be part of the engineer design for any underground sewer, a storm sewer work that would be taking place through this projected funding. So, and this timeline that you see on your screen now. So I don't have an exact dollar amount for the study quite yet. Based on my conversations with the engineer, they seem to think that the $650,000 estimate would be satisfactory to encompass the work, underground, the repaving, as well as a study to to manage stormwater for the areas affected by this project.
So to be extra clear, your 650,000 estimate includes that study.
Yes, based on my conversations with our engineer, it does.
Okay.
May I offer a suggestion then that this slide be modified and a row be inserted above the 2021 underground work to include the study so that people can see it in black and white. I am very, very skeptical of a project that does not include the material components of it. And the study is indeed material and should be reflected in even an outline of this project.
The study is certainly part of the project. There's no question about that. And this project, unfortunately, is a little bit more nebulous than Sharon Road repaving, simply because the final facts and figures on the American Rescue Plan Act funding are still vague at this point, but we're hopeful that those will be cleared up shortly. And I can come forward with a more detailed explanation, more akin to what's been shown for Sharon Road for this project once we have more specific fund availability, as well as anticipated work, including the study. But the study is absolutely going to be part of this project.
So David, originally the engineer was already done for this project, but at the conclusion of the Bethany events and everything else, council made a request or provided some guidelines, I guess, to the administrator at the time that additional studies needed to be made to better understand if there was some things that could be improved. So the original study for the engineering that gave the original numbers that we have, I think are a part of this. So the request from council was basically to go back and do further studies based on the outcomes of the Bethany discussions.
Yes, and any study that would be done, any additional studies that would be done would have the benefit of being done with the completion or near completion of the Bethany property and the work occurring there. So we would be able to, instead of analyzing stormwater runoff from a construction site, be able to analyze stormwater runoff from a completed site. So that's an added benefit that will let us anticipate and modify the proposal for this project based on what the final conditions are, as opposed to what the status of Bethany used to be or is today, or somewhere between those two.
I'd also, David, like to see the scope of that study in terms of previous studies done on Oak Avenue and Bethany overflow of water. I know I've got 2 or 3 studies here in my home office that the village had previously commissioned. And yet we're still having these problems. So I'm quite sure the residents and as well as council, but particularly the residents on Hedgerow and Albion, Warwick, et cetera, that are influenced and affected by this creek will really be interested in the complete summary of this study that is to be done and not simply something that has been attempted in the past. Thank you.
Yes, and it of course is a study, so it's hard to I don't want to promise the world here, but it is a study, so it would only present information. But
it's the
the
scope
villages
of it that we're interested, that I for one am interested.
exactly.
Thank you.
And if the stormwater project itself is anticipated to influence as much of the village as it proposes to, then this study would need to reflect the entire impacted area by that project.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. So next steps relative to these 2 items. will be, Sharon Road is much more firmed up at this time. At some point after the bids are received, an ordinance, and David's going to go get those bids, an ordinance will come before council likely around the June timeframe to do that work. As David pointed out, as the numbers firm up for the stormwater work and the road work, the stormwater work would be at 2021. The road work then would follow in 2022. And again, it would be a similar situation. An ordinance would come before council to appropriate those monies for that work. So we'll be on the lookout for that. That's basically the next steps for that portion of our infrastructure improvements.
Excuse me, with those two projects, correct me if I'm wrong, but the total drawdown on the VGPI is about 870,000. Is that
845? That's a nice segue, but about 845. So let's look at VPGI now, and let's go to that section of our agenda. VPGI and invested funds. I think, David, do we have some sheets that can be shown there, or
yes, would you like them? Is there one particular you'd like me to start with?
Well, we could start with the previous that showed 1.050 thousand for the road. That's the newer one.
Am I showing the correct one now? Unfortunately, I can't see what I'm sharing.
The other one, I'd like to see the other one first. And if they could be,
Okay.
Well, let's show the other one first.
Okay, give me 1 second. Let me get myself sorted out here. No, unfortunately, because they're both in Excel, I can only show one at a time.
I'm sorry.
But no, it's okay. It's not your fault.
I'm sure these things will be done again at the village office, and we won't struggle like this.
Well, hopefully we'll be meeting in person. It'll be just a matter of
Person.
handouts, but
This is similar to what we used to look at when we project forward, and there are several points to make about this. So David's got the box highlighted around projection for 2021, additional road and sidewalk work. Previously, when we looked at this in December, we were still estimating about $1 million worth of work on Sharon Road. And the federal funds for the American Rescue Package were not issued yet. So that gave us a sense of our future projected capital spending going forward for a number of years. So David, can we bring the next slide in, please?
Mm-hmm. Give me 1 sec. We'll have to switch back and forth here, unfortunately.
Sure. And hopefully we'll be able to stay on this one.
1 second here, everyone.
So if my math is correct, I think we're at about 845 now. 845 that we would spend for Sharon Road, and also that includes the spending from VPGI for the Hedgerow Albion stormwater work. And so the net effect of that is a savings a little more than 200,000 than what we had already estimated we would have to spend, thanks to grants and thanks to the federal funds that we anticipate receiving. And the net effect of that going out to 2030, if we even dare project that far, we have a better balance at the end, 8,235,000 versus what was 8 million, pretty much 8 million. So that's a nice savings. It helps us maintain our principal balance a little bit better, and again, be able to fund these major village projects. So I'm kind of happy that we're in this position with these additional funds we've been able to achieve.
So Mike, the 840, that would be the worst case scenario, assuming we eat up the whole contingency that we have shown on the roads.
That's correct. It could get better if we don't eat
Yeah.
up the contingency, yes.
Yes.
One additional thing we will do, again, when David takes over the drafting of these sheets, these may stay similar to what you see, but he'll be in charge of those. And one thing that we will do with, I want to say within the next 6 months, but I don't want to pile on to David's work. We really need to look at and build a new plan for capital expenditure going forward. This is a couple of years old. It makes various assumptions about when we need police vehicles and fire vehicles and new trucks for public works. And this should kind of be a living document that we revisit annually and make sure we're still on track. So that planning will be ongoing this year as well. I'm sure there will be things that will likely change around in this. Our goal is to be able to use our VPGI funds for major projects like we have been, and to try our best to maintain the principal balance that we have. You'll notice that after, a large amount of work in 2021 and a significant amount of spending in 2022, our fund balance drops about $1 million from 9.3 to 8.3. And this is overall invested funds. That's something else we'll probably work on. These are overall invested funds, including some of the invested general fund monies. So we might boil this down to just strictly BPGI. But the point I'm trying to make is, you can see if we're careful with spending, the fund balance goes down and then it starts to recover. And it would certainly be great if we could keep this, I think council is committed to try to keep this principal balance a decent amount that can help fund ongoing capital expenditures, including vehicles, and also these large projects that we run into. Now, the savings we talked about is great, that we may potentially see a $200,000 savings and get 2 projects done for $845 instead of 1 for $1 million. However, we do need to talk about the interest rate environment that we're in right now. And just to put things in perspective, this sheet does try to capture that reduction in interest rate. And remember, it's a blended rate over a period of time because we have a 5-year bond ladder. Some of our bonds are still at 2, or our CDs still at 2 or maybe a little over 2%. The new ones that you can purchase are less than 0.5%. And there are some savings accounts that are about 0.5%. But when you blend all that together, we're likely to only realize that you see in 2021 interest rate something less than 2%. And I think Mike's Bogrand's latest study corresponds with this, that we could possibly realize about $170,000 this year in revenue from these funds. And then it's going to drop again because there are no opportunities to buy any CDs that are a higher interest rate, and our high rate 2.5% ones are dropping off. They're aging out. So we end up with a less than about a 0.015. And I've held it there on this example. Whether or not that's going to be accurate will remain to be seen. And more information than anyone probably wants. Currently, commodity prices are rising. Little bits of inflation are showing up here and there. The labor market's tightening a little bit. And currently, the Fed chief has said maybe by 2023, there might be interest rate increases, but not before then. If we do see some slight interest rate increases coming, as we are able to purchase different investment vehicles it's possible that we can hang on to the 0.015 for a couple of years while we build back up higher interest rate paying instruments. So I just kind of left it there for the moment and have my fingers crossed. With that, you see that instead of being able to earn something in the neighborhood of 230,000 a year, we'll only earn about possibly 120,000 a year, maybe even less. So even though we're saving on these projects, we're going to lose that again in our earnings. So are there questions about that? Or is that enough about that?
Mike,
Yes,
there
ma'am.
should be data in row 27, which is not really visible on, there we go. Thank you.
Uh-huh. What that represents is the total amount of spending that had occurred over that period of time. And the average spend per year would be the 301. The interesting thing is if we can be disciplined, if this is a correct projection in 2030, you could spend over $2.5 million in infrastructure and major capital and still have a balance of $8,235,000 in your investments. I think that's very impressive that over a 10-year period, you can fund that much in CapEx and still have a decent amount of principal left to do it all over again for another 10-year period. As just to highlight, let's be careful with our spending and not spend down this nest egg.
Well,
It's very valuable to us.
We need to treat it like an endowment, like, you know, any endowment. If you eat up the principal, the endowment disappears. So
I agree. Interestingly enough, at that 2030 projection, at the number that says 240,531, if you go back over time, our typical capital expenditures have been in the 200 to 250 range. That's what it's been typically. So any other questions about that? Again, David and team will update all of the guts of this and keep it current going forward. So moving on to the next major item, other capital expenditure planning, which we don't need any slides for. So we have been in the process of upgrading infrastructure in the village for several years. And we're in the midst of coming near the end of some of the planning that's been in the works for 3, 4, maybe 5 years when it comes to water infrastructure and major road repairs like Sharon Avenue. So going forward, when we work on interior roads, our game plan is to look at the water infrastructure under those roads first. And one good example is Woodbine. Woodbine and maybe Fountain are some of the roads that would be next up to be resurfaced. But we do know that there have been some water supply line breaks on Woodbine. And so as we do the CMOM study, you folks have heard of the CMOM, and as Kevin works with, what's it called, David, the Water Regional Authority?
The Rural Water Authority.
Rural Water Authority, which only costs $300 a year to
It is the deal of the century.
Those are the guys with the super sensitive equipment that can go around and find leaks in our water system. So as we do the CMOM study and as we work with that group to find leaks in our water system, we identify those, we'll fix those first, and then we'll repave the roads, similar to our plan on Sharon Road. So that's why Tom is saying, let's go ahead and use our road funds, Fund 102 on Sharon Road, because there's no sense repaving a road like Woodbine if we've got problems underneath it. And he said we're in no danger of losing roadbed. It looks ugly, but we'll get to it, and maybe towards the end of the year, but certainly by 2022 year, we'll be repaving that road. So looking at what we've done and kind of where we're headed, a lot of this was water infrastructure, and we worked with the engineers and we identified the major problems in the infrastructure, and they recommended to us the things to take care of first. I think the biggest concern was the main from Congress west to Route 4, and that's been done. Their next major item they had was the valving that was near the water tower to make sure that if we needed to turn on the Greater Cincinnati Water Works, we were able to do that in a proper fashion, that the water would loop around correctly and everybody would have good pressure. That's been done. Now the next up was the water main Congress going east to Chester. That's the recent work that we did. And we were, of course, holding the repave of Sharon until that got done. Now, going back to the Congress west to Route 4, that was done with sort of a SAMI seal and a few years ago because we were losing roadbed. So that's part of our entire repave that we're going to do for the 1.250 million. Then the last thing on the list, and wasn't totally defined in the engineering study, some of it was all of the interior plumbing, and that's what I talked about, some of the plumbing in the historic district. Again, on Woodbine, we had some breaks this past year, and again, that's the point where we are now, and that's the work that will be done throughout the course of the year. I think, David, have we already appropriated funds for that CMOM study, I guess?
We do have a loan that we have secured to perform the planning stage, which is the first portion of that. That loan will not become paid, or we will not make payments on that loan until mid-2022, if I'm remembering correctly.
And if
it won't impact us this year.
Okay. And if I also remember correctly, about the time that debt service starts, we will be completing debt service on a 20-year loan, and the new debt service will be slightly less than the previous debt service. Service, principal and interest payments.
And that includes the debt service on Sharon as well. Correct. So that debt service will kick in as previous debt service expires, and will be a slight reduction.
A slight reduction. So we don't anticipate any more pressure from debt service, or any additional pressure from debt service, for the work we've got that we've already done and the work that we have teed up to do. Now, as we identify leaks or issues with the water when we do the research, then we'll need to appropriate funds.
Yes.
And that's where it'll be determined, where does that come from? Are there village funds available from general fund for this? And does it belong there? Or will the funding probably more likely would come from the enterprise fund?
It would.
And there'd be, depending on how much work needs to be done, does it need to be a loan? Is there enough reserves, or is there enough money in the enterprise fund? And then it would be our road funds, and then any additional funds, but probably the road funds are 150 to 200 a year coming behind the plumbing to fix and repave interior streets.
Correct.
So that's kind of a rough outline of the plan. Of course, when it's time to execute is when we'll have ideas of the actual dollars required to do all this stuff. But I think we need to keep ourselves on an aggressive plan to make these improvements and upgrades where they're necessary.
Hey, Mike, if anything is found that's significant with either sewer or water, are we allowed to dip into VPGI for that? Or does it have to be enterprise?
No, it would have to be enterprise. And if it is a substantial cost, our engineer would work to secure a low interest loan similar to what we've done with Sharon, to be able to address those replacements and improvements.
Okay.
So we would increase our debt service a little bit, but I'm confident that it wouldn't be substantial or harmful.
Okay. Other questions? Making sense. It kind of makes sense to me. So the interior roads will continue, and at the time we are set to repave those various roads, I think at this point, Tom is in discussions with David as to whether we use the SAMI seal that we have used, or have some road beds been built up enough they kind of need to be ground back down and start over again with asphalt. And those guys will recommend those decisions to us going forward. Also, just a little bit more about the CMOM. I think this is going to be a great thing for the village to be able to have a pathway and an engineering guidelines as to what needs to be done to get us up to speed. And we'll be spending our money intelligently. Hopefully we won't be chasing leaks anymore. Where, oh, the water main broke again, what are we going to do? We'll be able to identify where these things are and take a proactive stance instead of reactive. David, does this also affect the study of the watershed, which Marilyn was talking about, starting at, the Oak Road Greenbelt all the way through the village to the Sharon Road bridge?
The CMOM, you mean?
Does the CMOM work with that as well?
It may, in that if there's any inflow or infiltration in that area,
Okay.
that the CMOM is designed, the process rather is designed to identify that. I would imagine though that for the most part, we know that stormwater is above ground. We know it's not infiltrating our sewer systems. At least not in large quantities, but it would certainly give us a perspective on locations for underground utilities, as well as potential areas for improvement. So yes, although I think the stormwater study that I mentioned earlier would shed more light on improvements in that area.
That'll be the main piece for that.
Yes.
I think, David, as I recall, the CMOM was mostly initiated as a result of the May 2020 storm event, in which there were problems around the Sharon Road Little Creek culvert. And so I would count on the CMOM covering that very area. Yes.
Yeah, the CMOM influences a lot of our underground infrastructure for sewer and stormwater management. So yes, that would play a part in it. Absolutely.
Okay.
I'd like to make a suggestion that those who are interested in precisely what the CMOM is to go to the US EPA CMOM, and look at that document. It explains what the CMOM actually is designed to accomplish. I think there are some differences than what our conception of it is.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, are there any questions about that section or any of those items? All right. So now we move on to considerations to balance the general fund operating budget. And just, I prefer really just to have open discussion on this. There are a lot of ideas that people have. And as I mentioned, just to kind of put us back where we were, if these personnel compensation changes that we're anticipating, and UDF also pays the taxes we anticipate, if we make no changes then in 2022, that is no increases to any expenses, we would have a balanced budget. If, however, we were to make a change in the budget expenses, any amount that we would change upward is going to put us in a negative position. And that's just kind of very broadly, a broad way to look at it. I'm sure if you tried to fine tune that some more, you'd say, well, then it would be a $1,000 surplus and then you'd have, you know what I mean? But trying to hit it within a, you know, a $10,000 number, that's about where we would be. Again, to put in perspective, our typical increase of 2% on a $2.5 million budget represents $50,000. So if we did what we typically do, we would be looking at a $50,000 deficit for 2022.
Mike, excuse me 1 minute. A full year for UDF is what, 30,000?
Something like that, but Glendale only gets a part of that tax.
Right,
So Glendale's part of the tax is 7,000.
for a full year.
Yeah, the rest
Oh,
goes to the
Got
school.
it. Okay. All right, thanks.
I think there was some confusion because we talked about $32,000 coming in as additional property tax and so
Yeah,
forth. But-
exactly.
And
Yeah.
that was a miscalculation.
Yeah, so yes, overall ticket price is that, but Glendale's portion is
Got it.
28% or whatever it is, so.
Yeah,
I'll
thank
pay
you.
for the prior error in the calculation.
So just a quick question. For next year, do we assume the help from the Proctor Fund for the resource officer, would that disappear for 2022 versus this year? What's the difference
Okay.
in the contributions that we received from the Proctor Fund? I think it also included a crossing guard or something at some point, but.
Okay, the funding, there's some moving parts here, but basically where we're at, by the arrangement that we made with the Proctor Fund when we created the SRO program, they were paying initially and for the first 4 years of the program, $100,000 a year, which was intended to cover the cost of a full-time officer. Starting last year, their contribution dropped to $60,000. Now these contributions come in June, so they cover, each one covers part of 1 year and part of another year. So last June, we got $60,000. This June, we are to get $40,000. And next June, in 2022, we will get $20,000. And then after that, the funding ends. The crossing guard funding has ended as of now, I believe. Is that right, David? We'll check. We'll double check that, but I'm pretty sure it is ended. But we have had some discussions with the fund, and we had these discussions before too, as some of you may remember. When the funding first began to drop, it was right after the levy had failed. And so I went back to them and said, okay, I know the deal we cut, but we just had this levy failure. Would you consider, and I asked them to kind of soften the reductions a little bit and keep the crossing guard. And that suggestion was not well received, I guess for a number of reasons that frankly are not totally clear to me. Now, very recently, somebody reached out and said, if you just ask for funding the crossing guard for another couple years to basically to soften the impact of the reduced funding, there is a reasonable possibility that the fund would consider that favorably. So at this time, I'm in the process of drafting a letter to the fund, a request for funding just of the crossing guard. It's $12,000 a year for the next through 2023. So that would be their last contribution. And then that, the program at that point would be on the village. But we would at least have a little softer slope to the reduced funding. I've asked very pointedly, look, I'm always of the view that it doesn't hurt to ask, but last time I got asked and I got hurt. So that's not going to happen again, right? And so we're making sure of that, but I think the answer is that it should be received appropriately as a request. There's no guarantee it'll be granted, but it's a legitimate request. And there were some complicating factors last time that I won't go into that caused a problem.
For these discussions, these are could be's or whatever, but so should we assume there is only a certain minimum amount of support for those two elements as we talk about a potential deficit for 2022? How should we interpret that?
I think you should assume that the funding is going to be what the agreement says. $40,000 this June, $20,000 next June. That anything else is good, but the $12,000 is not going to balance any budget, and that's the only difference that's going to occur is we get $12,000 for an additional 3 years.
Mhm.
So should council therefore assume that we would be doing a 2% increase for COLA in those other elements, as Mike was pointing out, or how should we interpret what the 2022 likely deficit is or not?
My impression is when we do the 2%, it's across the board. We factor in a 2% increase, whether it's and we don't look at individual line items to say, well, is this really going to increase 2% or not? Some of them increase more, some increase less. In this case, we don't, and one of my challenges to Officer soon to be Chief Walsh, is to develop his plan for the SRO and crossing guard programs. And he's he's not there yet. He's just really started thinking about it. So we will see just what those programs are going to cost the village. And there may be ways to do it more efficiently than we have in the past, is the short answer.
Well, to maybe try to answer Mike's question, with all the moving parts and the possibility of adjusting with Officer Walsh or Chief Walsh, how he allocates funds for the SRO officer and whether he has less time for the SRO officer or whatever. Again, that's a lot of moving parts, as you suggested, Don. One way is we could manage our way to where the additional money coming in for the crossing guard again and your management of the SRO officer's time could bring us to a zero. The other thing I'm hearing is this June we get 40,000, next June we get 20,000 less. So if you do it just by the numbers, it's $20,000 less.
20,000 plus 50,000 if council assumes a 2% increase
So that's
across the
70.
board. So that's a 70,000 potential deficit.
If there's the ability to manage the SRO officer time, and we think we can narrow that down, or possibly the ability to say we don't need an SRO officer.
Well, I will get back to you when when Chief Walsh gives me his plan for
Okay.
the SRO, and then we can give you some hard numbers.
The worst case is 20,000 less, and there might be something better.
That is correct.
Okay.
So 20 plus 50 is 70, unless council wants to assume we're not going to have a 2% increase in the budget next year.
That has happened before.
I think, I recall there was a lot of discussion around compensation factors when we prepared the budget for this year. So from my perspective, it is very premature here on April 15th to talk about budget for compensation in 2022. There were still questions asked, I recall, by Will Kreidler that remain unanswered, at least from my perspective. And I very much like to have some answers to that around longevity and several other factors that were used in salary compensation and overall benefits. So I appreciate the discussion now, but it is far too early for me to engage in this in any meaningful manner.
And I agree.
I think the purpose is really to discuss if council should consider a levy for the November timeframe to enable a balanced budget without eating into reserves for 2022 and beyond. And I think we have a deadline to request a levy to be on the November ballot. David, do you have any of the details on that?
Yes, the deadline to submit a ballot measure for a levy would be August the 4th. There would be two pieces of legislation that would be required by council. The first is requesting an estimated revenue or estimated totals, and then it would be actually legislation approving the ballot language itself. So it's possible, although that date is approaching rather quickly, considering the number of council regular meetings remaining in the year.
Thanks, David.
Discussion today.
And considering the time we would need to properly communicate this and have open discussions with the community. There's very little time for that. You're right.
Will, you had a comment?
Yeah, Mike Bowe, what did you mean? Explain when you said 20 plus 50. What did you mean by that?
So if we're assuming that, as Mike Bessel mentioned, that we're looking at a $20,000 less contributing to our SRO officer for next year. So that's 20 in the hole. And then assuming council votes or considers that we do the normal 2% increase for,
okay, gotcha.
That's the 70. So
okay, thank you.
And as you know, as Nancy mentioned, I'm just concerned to make sure that we educate residents, that council has all the information in a timely basis, so that if council were to consider to put something on the ballot, everything was transparent. We had all the information. Otherwise, my concern is we'll choke up in the system, and then council will have to just vote to use reserves, probably to make up the deficit. And it just doesn't seem like the proper way to operate.
Other comments?
I guess we thought, I mean, I've given a lot of thought to this question of whether this is the year to put a levy on the ballot. And I've, based in, since the levy is actually for 2022, with a number of factors that Mike Bessel has alluded to, we don't really know at this point where we're going to be at in 2022. Mike Beaugrand has, highlighted that yes, there is a possibility of a $70,000 deficit. However, I don't think that's a working assumption at this point. It's not one that I would make. I think there are a number of sources of revenue that we've talked about that could reduce that. And so what I would like I would prefer to wait until November of 2022 if we are going and take a hard look at putting a levy on for that year, which would of course take us into the 2023 fiscal year. What it does mean is that we will have to start thinking about that increased levy well in advance. And I would certainly want to get it started before where we're at right now in mid-April. This is something that, because of the number of steps that the county requires of us, we have to, first of all, just see, we have an ordinance to ask how much revenue will this raise. We then have to develop language for the levy, and then it has to go through. Normally, it goes through 3 reads at council. I don't favor trying to put a levy on the ballot as an emergency measure, and so we would be holding special meetings of council, probably at least 1, if not 2. So I think this is not the time when I would like to see a levy on the ballot. But I think we all should be aware that come November of 2022, and really looking at the early spring of 2022, we would have to start thinking about a levy for fiscal year 2023.
Mr. Mayor, I don't see why we don't, in the spirit of full disclosure, announce that this is going to happen. I mean, we see, unless there are major changes, the council believes that 2022 is when we need to have the infusion of revenue, and that through a levy. And we start the communications with the community now, or within a couple of months, making that very clear that it's not this year we're talking about. But we're very serious about 2022. And we start to have formalized communication gatherings so that it's not just one public session, one public meeting. It's a series of them, and it's a number of communications, print and electronic and otherwise. But be very clear that we right now are not just talking about 2022, but it's on our calendar in ink, based on what we see, revenue and expenses for beyond.
I think that's quite well taken.
With the exception that I would ask that council basically agreed.
Yeah, I know where you're going. Yeah.
Any deficit were to occur in 2022, that the assumption is that we would use our reserves in our general fund to cover those. And then we wouldn't have to debate.
What was done in the past when it was necessary. That's what we've done. I
We
noticed
really have
Marilyn
no
was trying to
choice.
say something before, and I think you're muted, Marilyn. You were trying to talk before, and I think you were muted. Were you trying to make a comment?
I'll listen to others for a while. I do have a comment. I can make it now or a little later.
Well, yes, please go ahead.
All right. I am, as you would say, Michael, I've heard you say, I do not have the appetite to talk to the public now and in the coming months about an additional tax levy going on a ballot in 2022 or 2023. I think the village has before it this year in 2021 enough fiscal and financial priorities. It's infrastructure work that is underway, number one. Number two, the update and advancement of our financial reporting software, which to me is critically needed before we can make any credible arguments about the need for a tax levy. We have several other priorities that we were talking about, and I think to jump ahead and put before a public that's been whipsawed with so many issues, the prospect of a tax levy in 2022 when they have been hit with increased real estate property taxes, increased taxes for a lot of routine matters, as simple as renewing their automobile car registrations, and a lot of other new taxes that consumers are being hit with. I think it's so. I do not have the appetite for this going to the public, especially when we have time to address this in a more responsible manner. I have nothing further to say about this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your comment.
I do have one item for David. Do we happen to have another renewal in 2022, tax renewal?
Yes, we will have a renewal in 22.
I think, Mike, I had a comment about that. And I think we need to be aware that there is some difficulty and extra education or communication that would need to occur when we have a renewal levy in 2022, and then we ask for an additional levy. I think it's worked in the past when we did the 1.5 mil 9 years ago or 8 years ago. I don't know, I guess wondering out loud, is it easier if it's on a non-renewal year to pass a tax levy? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think we do, because we failed the last levy. We had a renewal and a new tax levy, and the new tax levy failed because they were on the same year.
It could be it was easy to vote for one and not the other. I think it also failed. It might have been too much. I heard several people say if it wasn't 2.5 mils, they might have voted if it was 1.5 mils or something like that. So the unfortunate thing for us is the longer we wait.
Ideas and suggestions. You know, I don't get to vote, but I do look at the numbers, and I try to provide information for council to make the right decision to keep us on the right path. So 2022, we will have a renewal that we will have to talk about. And if we have an increase, that'll be a lot of discussions that we will have to have so that we don't fail like last time. So, and I'll be here to support council if I'm still the treasurer in whatever capacity.
But can I say something here, Michael?
Yes, please.
Again, we're, as a council, we're kicking the can down the road. We've got major projects that are going to happen this year. We could potentially, and this is conservatively speaking, but if things dissipate like are happening across the country, we may not be able to afford what we're doing. Now, I know that we've got a plan on your budget, and David's got a plan, but we're dangerously close to not being able to present a balanced budget. And I think that, you know, I think our citizens, our neighbors understand that the village of Glendale is a special place, and to be here, you really have to pay for it. I mean, our tax levy, we have an increased tax over from what we've renewed in close to 10 years. And I just think that, I think it would be worse not to have the renewal or not to have a new levy and go to a place that we're running negative. I think that it's a dangerous position that we're putting our village in. I think we ought to just start at it now and get it done as soon as we can get done. And it's like I said, it's 10 years, and people see the fact that we can no longer pick up their garbage cans at the, at the door and that kind of thing. And that's when you start looking at those kind of things that Glendale is used to. I just hate to see us be that close. And I'm sorry, but I think we need to get on it and get it done, and take our chances and try to and sell this, because your numbers pointed out. If we can't save money, we ain't gonna have money next year. So then it is an emergency. So my opinion only. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I think if we can remember from last night's meeting regarding the saving Glendale's green spaces and the CIC, a lot of voices were expressed that they don't want to see essentially Glendale go downhill any further. They want to see Glendale like it used to be. We have Mr. Brock, who's proposed a great improvement to Summit Park because he'd like to see it like it was and all the benefits we have. That no one wants to sell off. It has been expressed that they don't want to sell off what they feel are either green belts or green space. And I think many comments have been made then and in verbal conversations and in social media that they realize that the village is operating on the edge of financial income, and have also expressed that they would consider an income tax. I think, as I said last night, that that's the third or fourth alternative, but the next alternative is probably asking for a levy to be approved and allow the village not only to squeak by and to balance the budget, but maybe to have some extra dollars to do some things that we now defer. And I will use the parks as an example. The Summit Park is deteriorated, and hopefully we can get some money, as we talked about earlier, I think in this meeting or the last, from the community development. But if we don't, we can simply further defer making improvements and simply try to not make things deteriorate any more than they have over the past time. And if I may, Mike Bessel, and when we talk about a 2% increase in our budget because of salaries, et cetera, I think that's probably going to be conservative. The number quoted to us a couple of years ago from the engineers who provide us service on the water, on utilities, if you recall, they say plan on increasing your water bills 4% each year. And we're facing a situation with the government handing out lots of money. We're going to face inflation.
We will.
And so I think 2% is very conservative in terms of our cost increase. So I think that, as Alan said, it would probably, we need to not kick the can down the road. We may not get it approved. We may get a lot of protests, but we can make that decision, but it should be put up for consideration soon, in my opinion.
Will, you had a comment that you wanted to make, and then we kind of got to get moving along.
Okay, question and then comment. Question, when we were talking about the Sharon Road project, the $325,000 that was coming out of our general budget, that was, I guess, David, we kind of said that could come out of reserves. How, let's just assume we use all of that. How much safely, so let's say we run a $37,000 deficit this year and about, let's just call it 60,000 next year. Do we have the reserves in the general, not BPGI or not the bond ladder. But do we have sufficient reserves for the next 2 years
We
to cover
do.
those?
Yeah, we do.
Question is, we want to use them.
What, I know we don't want to use them, but what would be worst case we could use?
Worst case, I would say, from my perspective, I would not want our general fund to go below 600,000 to 700,000, and with that, we would be 325 plus 37 or 35 for easy sake. So 360 plus another 50. We would be at about 410, and we're at about 1,000,003. Yeah, we would be right about there. We would be right at about 600.
Just to be clear, David,
yeah.
right now, we have about 1.3 million in the reserves, a little over that. And if we take out the 325, that puts us down at 1 million. And you're saying that in order to run the village safely, you're looking for about 600 or so in the reserves. So
Yeah.
the short answer to Will's question is yes, there is money in the reserves to cover deficits that over 2 years that would say total 150.
Plus the 325 for the Sharon Road.
Well, the 325 I'm taking off. I'm
Oh,
saying
okay. Yes.
we have those 1.325,
Okay.
whatever in
We can
the
see there are some
reserves
reserves
now.
There
and
are
we
reserves enough to cover a deficit for the next couple of years if we had to.
Yeah.
Will, do you think a levy would pass in November?
Let me go back to my first tour, my first stint. As we talked about a couple times on here, that was 1.5. That, and Nikki White's famous words, we were the second cow to the trough. Princeton had beaten us the year before with a huge, if you remember, 2010, 2011, Princeton had that huge tax hike.
Yeah.
And after that, I think actually all 6 of us agreed that 1.5 is probably going to be the max that we could pass back then. And if I recall, that passed pretty comfortably. And then was it 2 years ago, the 2.5 did not pass. And so we always have to keep Princeton, because like you said on the UDF earlier, we always just sort of assume we get that money. And so many of us forget that we just get a percentage of the property tax. So, I guess the question, if we wait till 2022, that tends to be a pretty big election, with the congressional races. If you did it this year, we could add, let me backtrack. With that year, we did a couple town halls. We all took turns at the street fair explaining the budget. We took, council got a booth, and we took turns where 2 of us talked for 2 straight days, took turns about educating. And so kind of what Marilyn and Alan said, if we talk about not only spending, but the revenue, here we are, we're 6 months away from November, 7 months away. So, I mean, I need to think about this some more, but I don't have a firm answer right now. But I think if we were to go smaller, we have a much better chance passing it this year. If we wait and go with a larger levy, and not necessarily kicking the can, but going with a larger levy, I think not only could Princeton beat it to us, but then if the inflation or the economy, if those national potential issues start to hit, then that's also competition for us.
And the renewal. And the renewal.
Yeah.
I think though, let's go back to Nancy's point, which is that if we are going to do something, we need to start communicating it now. And I think honestly, to present a levy as an orderly part of the village that the council has given careful consideration to, right now, I think we'd be springing it on them. And I think it would not go over well. I think if we start communicating now that we are going to have a levy in another year, I think people will be ready for it. and there will be time to think about it and digest it and discuss it. And I think that's got the better chance of success.
I disagree. I think we've got 4 months. I think people like Jeff mentioned on Facebook and everywhere else are saying we've got to do something. Let's not just sell the land. Let's figure out how to do other things. And people are really rallying around. We need another different source of revenue versus selling off Glendale. So, I mean, I think council can pull this thing off. I'm really concerned that if we do it during a renewal year, we're going to have all sorts of problems, and then we're going to be going down the reserves over and over. So my opinion is, I think this year, I think I agree with Will, 1.5 would be a manageable number that I think would support the village for a while. And I think it has a high probability of passing.
Mr. Bessel,
Yes.
pardon me, right at this time when I don't want to do this, I've got to hop off. I've got a commitment.
Okay.
I'm really sorry. So
Okay. Thank you.
thank you for listening.
You bet. Thanks.
I'll vote for you, Nancy.
So,
Just
very quickly, we're talking also about, I hate to get this granular, but we're talking, there's been a lot of discussion about whether Glendale needs an SRO officer and all that. And that would be a savings, but I see that as a sideline issue. I don't think $20,000 less per year makes or breaks us, especially when we can see that every year the typical increase is $50,000. I am somewhat concerned about trying to pass the two levies at the same time. That is a renewal levy plus a new levy. I am more concerned about a point that Will made, where if within this year or early into next year, we go into some sort of a recession or prices start to climb and we see inflation, how people are going to perceive a tax increase if they're seeing pressure. And as Will pointed out, that's competition for us. That's another place where people are getting hit in the pocketbook. So and with communication, I know that's a difficult thing to do. I don't think you need a full year though to tee this up. How many people here think that the folks who organized for do something besides sell our green space, would they organize around this because they're very good? Would they vote for this levy, do you think?
I'm confident that I know a couple of individuals who would and who are very active in the green space issue.
Okay.
Mike, I have no way of answering that question.
Okay.
Mike, did you mean for this November about
For this November.
at 1 or 1.5 mil?
Yeah.
I'm agree with Marilyn. At this point, I don't know, but I do, everyone's been cooped up in their house for a year. So I just don't, it's been such a strange last 12 months. I'm just not sure.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. And we certainly don't want it to fail, and we don't want it to, so if we put it on the ballot in November and it fails, then how do we fare in 2022 at that point if we try it again? What are the ramifications of that?
Well, ramifications would be council would have an opportunity to talk to the residents and say, if we can't pass the levy, we'll be further down the road now. The deficit will be greater. And council would have to consider making some service reductions.
Or an income tax.
Or an income tax.
Okay.
I'm not prepared to accept either of those options either. I think the public, and as I said before, I've already spoken. So I think, Michael, that we're being very, very speculative now. And I'm like Nancy, it's almost over 2 hours, going on 2 hours. So if there was something else that you wanted to cover on the agenda, I'm just struggling right now with this kind of speculation.
Well, it's
I'm
not,
sorry.
no, it's not necessarily speculation. It's.
I know.
What is our village's best approach to increase our revenue because we need it? And that's what that is.
I agree, but we need so much more data and information on our financial picture that
Could that information
even
be
for some of the information that we have, some of the items that we have on the agenda today, there's a lot of information, material information that is still outstanding to be provided to us. And so you're losing me here.
Yeah,
That's the short of it.
There's a lot in the form of estimates. David, could that information be generated? I mean, could we get a more grounded projection for 2022?
Absolutely. It's a matter of a lot that has been up in the air over the past couple of weeks. So understandably, it's not where I would want it to be. You mentioned getting into June timeframe. I anticipate we would be able to have more concrete information coming out in the next month and a half of capital planning over the next 5 to 10 years. Of course, that's precarious in and of itself because once you get off past 5, it's hard to say. But yes, I think we could get that information together relatively quickly so that a more concrete decision, and like Marilyn mentioned, we can have more data available to us to make those decisions.
Yeah, let me also say that, colleagues, we really don't have the financial reports, the cash transactions, the revenue, the expenditure reports for the first quarter of this calendar year. So I am still trying to get a handle on where we are this year. It's very reassuring to hear Mike Bessel and David say that there are no real surprises and that we should meet our budget expectations and expenditures and revenues for this year. But still, we do need that first quarter data. So I don't want to prolong this, but given that we are short of staff and that we're still catching up on information that we would normally have, I would ask that we prioritize what we're asking and where we're going this right in the next quarter coming up. I'm sorry. Thank you for listening.
So Will, where would you be? I'll just go around the group. Should we put it on this November? Should we wait till next?
You give me a week, I think.
Okay.
You want, if you want an answer right now, I would say, if I had to tell you right now, I would say wait till 2022. But if we were to do 1 mil, I'll let someone else go. If we were to do 1 mil, maybe 1.5 mil, I consider November. I would highly consider this November, but not more.
But not a definite. Jeff, where would you stand on it?
I think we should proceed for November. We ought to do it now.
All right.
If it doesn't pass, then we go from there.
Alan, where are you? The same? You're muted still.
You're muted. You're muted, Al.
You're muted.
Alan, you're on mute.
Well, I'm muted.
Yes.
I agree with Jeff and Will. I hate kicking stuff down the road on an IFCOM, and I'd rather know by November if we've, have the backing or not have the backing, and then we can dance a little if we have to. But I think I think most of our citizens understand the problems today.
They do. I don't see a lot of harm in asking myself. Marilyn, what do you need to feel comfortable to ask for a tax levy addition? Whether it be even in November of this year or November of 2022, what would you need to be comfortable asking?
Are you asking me what would I need, what would I feel comfortable in asking in terms of a percent or dollar amount or information or what?
In terms of what information do you need in order for you to be comfortable to go to the public and say, we need a tax levy addition?
I want to be clear because right now, today, I need the first quarter financial information on our cash, on our revenue, our expenditures, our cash transactions to see exactly where we are now compared to what we have budgeted. And we do not have that information right now. I also need right now to hear some time frame and some talk around integrating our old data, our old financial data into the new financial software that we anticipate being uploaded now. We've had no conversations, no talk, no real information around that. And I have experienced it and know it takes some concerted effort. You simply can't download new software and start generating new reports. There has to be some kind of reconciliation and integration of the old financial software. Otherwise, we're mixing apples and oranges. Right now, those are the things that I need to see right now. I need to see where we can trim some of the expenses that we have going on. And to do that, we need the financial reports. I appreciate what David and everyone's doing, but like I said before, there's too many things up in the air financially with the village for me to go to the public, for me to go to my neighbor and argue in behalf of a tax levy.
And once you had that information, I'm assuming you would want it to show that we are just barely a break even or even a negative, and then that demonstrates need.
I think the information, I think the financial data needs to speak for itself.
That's fine.
And if we are in financial need, then it will show that.
Right.
But
And
I think
if
we
there's a
need to do
surplus,
a lot better showing our financial picture than what we did 2 years ago.
Okay. Got it. So, and then before we break, I'm just going to ask this question, our level of success. And this is a risky question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are our chances, or what's our level of success asking for a levy if not all council people are on board with it?
Very good question.
I'd much
You
prefer.
mean if it's not a 6-0 vote?
Yeah. If the council is split on whether or not it's necessary to go for this, then what position do we put ourselves in?
I think the public will have information. The public will know what
Based on the information.
understands and on how to manage the finances of the village. I think it'll be very transparent. So I think.
Well, excuse me, but we've had tax levy before. And whether or not there was a 6-0 vote or a 4-2 vote or a 5-0 vote, it appeared on the ballot. So I don't think that question would be really dispositive.
Okay.
I think all of the levies that I've been aware of since I've been here have been 6-0 votes. I mean,
Well, I recall the last levy, and there was a 6-0 vote to put the levy on the ballot. However, there were clear statements made during council meeting that the vote was to put it on the ballot for the residents to decide. It would not indicate and did not indicate the council members supported the levy. I recall that very well because that's how we went into that last tax levy in what year was it? 2018?
Yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Nevertheless, the appearance was mistakenly put forth to the public that all council members supported it. But when people had a chance to speak in behalf of them, of their individual selves, or as council members, there was division. There was not unanimity. So I don't want to give the mistaken impression that there was a unanimous vote of council members the last time that supported the levy.
Well, unfortunately, at this point, in my mind, I don't know if there's clear direction for the overall picture right now. I feel it's important that Glendale has the funds it needs to maintain the village in an appropriate manner.
Mhm.
I just think that our revenues fall short of that this year, or will be possibly fall short of it this year. And with any type of reasonable inflationary impact, we will definitely fall short in 2022. I don't think we can trim expenses anymore. And I do not think that our expenses will stay flat in 2022. So that means a deficit. But from a political standpoint and how this proceeds out into the public, I'm out of my realm now. I'm not a political animal. I don't know how it would work. So
Well, let's face it, this is the first serious discussion we've had of this subject this year. So I think it is reasonable for everyone to step back, give it, as Will suggested, he needs at least a week to think about it. And do we want to call another finance committee meeting in another week? And have people sit down and decide where they're really at?
if the group's up for that, we could.
I mean, I think it's the only way you can make the decision.
Well, you
Because
can't.
we have to get moving if
Yep.
this is what we're going to do.
Right. If we want to do something, we have to start with the next council meeting.
Mhm.
We have.
Yes. So
So-
we should have some, and that's going to be a request to the auditor's office to tell us how much a revenue would raise. So we have to have a number to give them by that time.
Correct. So looking at next week, what is everyone's calendar? What looks good? And it would be 5 o'clock again. I hate to do this to people.
I think it's necessary, Michael.
So we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I'm even willing to work on Friday. I'll save my beer for later. It'll be a one-topic meeting. So how's everybody look? Will?
We got
My Tuesdays and Thursdays are bad for the next 2 weeks.
Okay. Marilyn? What days are you available?
Next week, oh gosh. Goodness.
We had tentatively penciled in, Marilyn, a utilities meeting for Tuesday.
We did,
Uh,
we did.
But
Jeff.
Will is not available. I was going to say we could defer that.
Well, I'm wondering,
I,
the real question is, will we have the financial data and information between now and Tuesday?
I think we can have better information than we have right now. But
We will have first quarter complete data for revenues, expenditures, and cash transaction reports.
First quarter, correct. I agree with that.
And for me, I think that's the focus of our need to meet.
Okay,
We also need to hear more about the financial software that's being installed and the reports that will be generated. Jeff, I understand you're yielding the time that was reserved on Tuesday for the Utilities Committee to meet. Nevertheless, we still need to meet because we have very important financial business to deal with in that committee.
I think Will said Tuesday wouldn't work. What days would work for you for this meeting, Marilyn? For a finance meeting, what days would work?
How's everyone look on Wednesday, the 21st?
First,
Okay with me.
Possible for me.
Okay with me.
Everybody good then? So it's Wednesday.
Morning. I'm good early in the afternoon.
What time?
3, 4 o'clock.
Can we do 4 o'clock? That'll help me too. Everybody good for 4 on Wednesday?
Yep.
So you need to close the loop with Nancy.
We will. So 4 o'clock Wednesday for now, and we'll talk to Nancy. We'll get as much data and financial information as we can. People can make their own decisions. And we'll try to figure out if we've got unity, we could go forward with it. And if we don't, maybe a majority wants to go forward with it anyway.
And I would encourage you, Mr. Chair, that maybe you communicate in the announcement of the meeting what the main topic will be, so that residents will be able to listen and maybe even contribute, after the fact or something.
We can do that, David, can we not?
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. You and I can talk about
You're the,
phrasing.
you're the scheduler.
It would be
Yeah. David, I'd also like you to put together a timetable of the key steps in getting a levy on the ballot. So that
Absolutely.
we can plan what we're going to have to do.
Yes.
All right.
And Mr. Mayor, can we also have a time frame for the new software and migrating our financial data into that? So we'll know more about it.
We have been discussing that and we can get that. But honestly, I don't know it's going to make any difference because the numbers at the end are going to be about the same, no matter which software you use.
Right. The software I don't think is
I
going to.
want to provide a little context about that.
Yeah.
UAN's reporting is not wholly undifferent from what we currently use. UAN stands to benefit the village in a number of ways, namely that it is supported by the state, makes our annual reporting and audit processes much easier and quicker than they currently are. It also allows us eventualities of staff needs that we can find more staff members that are more familiar with it than our current system. Reporting and the structure of what will be provided to council will come out of my office. So that is independent of whatever software program the village is running. So I can provide a timeline for the transfer to UAN or a rough one. But ultimately it's just a matter of spending time to create reports that council thinks is informative and easy to follow as opposed to what was previously being used.
I think this has been of interest in our Utilities Committee meeting discussions, and it may be helpful, David, for you to start assembling and sharing with some of us samples of what the reports look like. It's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to actually see the various sample financial reports that can be generated.
And I intend to provide that. Unfortunately, as things stand right now, the office is a staff of 2.
I understand
we have
that.
we have a new hire coming on in May. More information about him will be coming out here shortly, but that will be the time that I'll eventually have some breathing room to spend time focusing on sort of the philosophy and theory behind those reports, and I can prepare those for council. So as of right now, unfortunately, we might have to make do for this next week's meeting based on our old information. I can try to condense it, but anything substantial is going to take some time to prepare.
Very good. Okay, so we've got another meeting date. Thanks everyone for your time. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So move.
Second, okay,
And
good.
second,
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you
Thank
next
you.
week. if not
thank you.
before.
Good job.
Righty.
All righty. Have a good night.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night, all.
Night.
Good night.